Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 202, The Essentials, Pull and Push Compensation. Welcome in, folks, and welcome into an episode that I've, as you see, titled The Essentials, Pull and Push Compensations. Why am I putting the essentials on there? Because I have been asked to do some back to basics teaching. Now, I know for a lot of you folks who have been with me throughout this journey of both being on the Takeup and teaching in general, who have been on the embroidery journey for quite some time, things like pull and push compensation can feel like they're fairly simple, like they're intuitive to you, and that maybe is something you don't need to hear about. Hopefully you don't feel that way. If you do, then hopefully this is something you can kind of listen into and just hear in the background and have some sort of osmotic experience of absorbing a little bit more about pull and push compensation. However, what I'm going to tell you guys is part of this is not only coming from something that we talked about earlier, the recent survey I did that is attached to the free class. We're going to talk about that again in a second. That's coming out here shortly, that you guys are going to be at least dispersed, that will be sent out to you, dispersed to everyone here shortly. But it's also coming in from some interesting data that I had recently. And it turns out that one of the largest growing segments of Takeup viewers and people who are sharing my content are younger and are just starting out in the embroidery journey, which explains why so many people were asking me on the background, people who weren't necessarily daily commenters or people who are in there every week being here live with the rest of you wonderful reciprocators, folks who are here giving back, but are there watching and looking for that foundational content, that basic content, that essential content that's going to help them to understand how embroidery works at a base level so that they can create what they want to create and have repeatable results throughout their embroidery journey. So knowing that, I'm going to say we'll have some of these essentials sets of classes, of experiences, of lives where I talk about something that is back to basics, but is absolutely essential in the classic sense of the word. It is the essence of embroidery and is something that you cannot be without if you want to understand how to control your embroidery and digitize. So that's why we're going to go back to a little bit of basics today and talk about push and pull compensation and push and pull distortion in general, as well as some surprising things, or at least for some people, surprising things that might be contributing to the way it's turning out for you. I mean, a lot of people really talk about this as a function of what's going on in software and drawing, where it can be also very material and it can be related to your equipment. So there are many things that can happen that makes this kind of different, kind of turn out differently. So with that, folks, let's go ahead and start into some of that. I will say hi to everybody. We will have some other business here on the lead end. So we will get into that. Like I said, we will be talking about pull and push distortion and pull and push compensation throughout. But before that, we do have a little bit of business to get out of the way. And I want to say hi to everybody. So first thing, let's say hi to folks who are here. If you are on the replay squad, if this is something you don't want to do, if you're here for the content, go ahead and fast forward. But otherwise, I like to say hi to the folks who are here and who are listening live. So let's go ahead and say hi to the folks who are here, who have been showing up early and talking to each other as well. I have to filter through because you guys start talking in the chat, which I love. But Cindy is in saying good afternoon. B is in saying good morning to everybody over in Australia. So happy to see you here as well. Everybody talking to each other. Frank from out in the UK, thank you for tuning in and always sharing, Frank. Doing always a great job of fostering community in the embroidery world, which I love. Everybody talking to each other, which I love. Barb is showing up from Minnesota Custom Made. Happy to have you in as well. Jan's coming in from Texas. Doug is in from Los Angeles. We have lots of folks talking to each other. Scott from Sunrise is here as well, saying happy Friday to everybody. So a lot of the crew here. Lisa Shaw, my compatriot and Brilliance, also saying good afternoon. Ready to work with you, chatting with me in the background as I do some stitching. Hey, that's the best way to do it right there. If I weren't recording, I'd be stitching too. If you couldn't hear it, I'd be running the machines for sure. Michael says, first time on. Thank you for being here, Michael. Thank you for joining in as well. And yeah, Frank says, this is absolutely true. Such a confusing subject. The reason why I started with push and pull compensation isn't just because people asked about it. It's because it is probably the singular problem that ties everyone together when they first start in embroidery. The one thing that causes issues, and I would say also with embroiderers only, people who aren't digitizing, but especially with digitizers, the one thing that causes that transition from what's happening on screen to what's happening on the machine to be confusing and upsetting is pull and push distortion, the one stumbling block that is common to all embroiderers. And like I said, it really can get through the entire process. It can be digitizing issues, it can be material issues, it can be equipment issues. All of these things play into it because it is so foundational to how embroidery works. We know we have stitches under tension. We are putting a lot of holes and dropping thread through fabric. We are going to cause distortion, which I'm going to say repeatedly. But in knowing how that works, why it works, we can really control it in a much more, I wouldn't just say in a way that is itself, set up, controlled, repeatable, but in a way where we have a basic understanding and we feel the physicality of this thing. We should never forget, and I'm going to say this repeatedly, we should never forget that this is a very physical thing that we are doing. We are piercing our garment repeatedly with a needle thousands of times. Each time we do, we pierce it with the needle and we leave behind the thread, and that thread is still there. And what does that mean? Is that our fabric that had the threads very close together in the weave or in the knit now has a new thread there that has to move the other threads out of the way. This is a physical process. And the same thing, stitches under tension. Every stitch we make, we pull our thread through, even on an embroidery machine, and that thread now is under tension, pulling on the other threads, and under tension, trying to squish down and tighten in. And that physicality is what describes what's going on. If we start to think of it that way, instead of imagining this digital reality of what the design looks like in our software versus what it's coming out on the machine, and we think that reality of the software, that the screen has anything to do with that, yes, it has something to do with it, but the ultimate result is only understood in the embroidery. We have to understand the physicality of this thing if we're going to get it. Last couple of people who are saying hi before I get into the business and on to the show. Starfish coming in from Munich. Thank you for being here. Love to see folks out in Germany, so that's great. And everybody's saying hi as well. So thank you for welcoming each other too. I mean, love that we have such a great and welcoming community. Love it. But yeah, it's and Lisa says, here's some levity to add to this. Every time you give this physicality description, I see a whole torture chamber set up. I mean, yeah, we really are torturing garments. If you've ever taken embroidery out of a garment, and I know most of you have, you know just how many holes we drive through it and how many knots are tied in it and how it pulls the threads apart. This really is a very physical thing we're doing that's super intrusive to the garment. So we have to understand that. And that these stitches, the physical stitches, are interacting with each other all the time and causing problems and causing things to look not in the way that we would want them to look, certainly. And absolutely, that interaction is probably what we're going to talk about today. So before we get into that, though, last couple of pieces of business. If you guys were here for episode 200, where I promised to give away the recording of my Understanding Emblems class, so the Understanding Emblems class where I talk all about how to make patches, today is the final day to sign up on the Google form. You won't get it immediately today. Over the weekend, I'll be processing all your forms and sending out links to people to allow you to have access to both the Understanding Emblems class. It's about a 4-hour recording, as well as the Y Patches preview class that was involved in that. It was another live session, and the handouts. All of that's going to come to you, but you have to, like I said, it was always respond before 9:20. Well, it is 9:20 today where I'm at. I'm turning this thing off myself tonight at midnight. So if you do not get in on that form, you will not have the chance. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and copy this into the chat. Again, I will put it in the description. I know some folks said in YouTube's chat, it's not something that you can actually click on. I understand that. You might have to screenshot it. I will put it back in the description, or go back to episode 200 on my channel. It is in the description right now as we speak. This is the final day to sign up. If you give me your email and agree to get an email back from me, and if you are willing to not only get that email, but let me have a couple of questions answered about you, I will send that back to you. There are, however, 3 other questions that I've asked everybody nicely to answer. However, they are not required. They don't stop your form from going through. I've asked you what you like about the show and what you would like to see covered in these shows, as well as just a question about what's the most embroidery question you would like to have covered in any show, just something that's important for you to learn. If you answer those, I would greatly appreciate it, because that will directly inform the shows that are coming up. This show today, as well as shows I've already done since, comes out partially from that survey. So if you answer this, not only are you getting class, let's say you think you know everything about patches, you don't really want to watch my class, that's fine. You've taken another patch class and you're going great guns. No issue there. I would still recommend you sign up that survey, and you can even tell me you don't want the class in the comments, and you can still answer and say, hey, here's what I'd like to see on this show, because I'm going to be heavily weighting those answers when it comes down to the next shows I pick, the next show topics that I pull together. So those are getting the top recognition from me. So if you would like to have that class, so the Understanding Emblems class where I talk all about making small run patches, go ahead and sign up at the form, respond today, and I do mean today, because it will close tonight and I won't be opening that back up for some time. And you will get the Understanding Emblems class, the Y Patches class, like the live session, and the handouts. Those recordings will be coming to you free of charge from me in recognition of that 200th episode. So there's that. That's part of the big business. Respond today. It's your last chance. And then you'll get the class. The good thing about that is next week, Friday, I'm going to tell you the episode already. I'm going to do a tie-up and update of new things in the patch world that I had not had a chance to talk about in Understanding Emblems. So we're going to do a patch session next week as well. And that will include Q&A for everybody who's already watched that session next week. Once I give you guys that session, if you get a chance to watch in or watch that stuff, get into it a little bit and you have questions, that will be next week's show as well. We will talk about that and do a follow-up after you guys have had a chance to look at that. So yeah, sign up today. It's your last chance. However, with that, there is one other little piece of business. I have a new article out that you guys might enjoy, and so I'd like to go ahead and share those here as well. This one is called Learning the Good and Bad from the Ugly. This one is out of Images Magazine, so I'm going to throw that up on screen, and you'll also get a chance to see that here too. Here is the latest article from Images Magazine. I'll go ahead and copy this also into the comments so you guys can have a chance to grab that if you want to. But this is the article that I was talking about. It is all about how to make the best out of bad situations, and honestly, how to listen to a customer, even if their art is poor, even if their art is bad, featuring the one that you guys have seen me talk about many times before, the Sloppy Joe, and talking about that story a little bit. But in here are just a really good kind of smaller version of some of the stuff I've done on the live shows, talking about listening to customer requests and what that means to you. So if that's interesting to you and you want to talk about that or see what you should do when people give you ugly art, and how to take that well and how to use it to your best advantage as far as learning stuff from it, making the best embroidery you can, and so forth, I would go ahead and head over to images-magazine.com. Should be something you can find from the front page. However, this is the direct link. I've put the direct link also in the chat, and you can check that out and learn a little bit from that session. So if you enjoy that, go ahead and grab that article, and I would love to have you guys take a look at it. And also, by the way, since I'm here and I'm sharing my screen, let's go ahead and put this up as well. This, again, is that form I talked about. All you have to do to fill out to get that free class is to put your email in, your full name, and your address. Those are the only required things aside from agreeing that I'm going to send you that email. And then these last three questions are just ones I would love for you to answer if you were willing. Okay, so with that, that's the business today. That is the stuff that has to be done before the session. Let's talk about pull and push distortion, right? Let's get into it. So pull and push distortion and pull and push compensation. What are they? What are we talking about? What is the issue that makes them important to us? And I think the thing that we have to talk about essentially is the natural distortion of embroidery. The first thing to say is this. Distortion in and of itself is always going to happen when we embroider, right? I talked about the physicality of embroidery before. So when we talk about pull and push distortion, this is just the natural response of, like I said, stitching thousands of threads through a garment under tension. So what do I mean by that? We know that thread is under tension. We talk about tension adjustments. Well, every stitch that you put through a garment is under tension. It is trying to collapse itself. It's a loop. I mean, it's actually two loops of thread, but they are pulling against each other. They are trying to collapse. So along the length of any stitch, it's always trying to get thinner. If I'm looking at a straight satin column vertically in front of me, that column on screen will always be wider than what eventually ends up on the machine. And we're going to talk about this repeatedly. Same thing happens with push. As we add stitches to our material, not only is the material behind here having stitches added to it, it is spreading out. So the material spreads out. So it tries to move out of the way. And as we stack stitches on top of each other, they roll off of each other down to, they try and maintain a single layer and they roll off of each other the more stitches we add to something like a satin stitch. So if I had that same vertical column of satin stitches, it is always going to be taller, pushing up and down in that vertical plane than it is on screen. That's the biggest, easiest way to put this thing. If I think about that vertical satin stitch column, the thing is, it's the same with a block of fill stitches. It's the same with any kind of collection of stitches. In the angle of the stitches, so let's imagine our fill or our satin stitch has horizontal angles. I'm going to show you better graphics than me holding up my hands. In the angle, in the stitch angle, so also the stitch angle you set on a fill. When you set a stitch angle on the fill, in that angle, you're always going to have pull. And perpendicular to that angle, so if we're talking about a horizontal angle, perpendicular to it, the other direction, 90 degrees, we are always going to have push. So that is what we're really dealing with. That is pull and push distortion. But why is it happening? Because stitches are under tension and they're pulling. They are pulling against the fabric and they're gathering it together towards their centers. And why is push happening? Because we are pushing apart the fibers in the fabric and we are pushing apart the stitches in our filled object. And as they roll off, as they pull down to the surface of the garment, as they interfere with the fabric, we're spreading them out in that direction. So it is dependent on stitch angle, the nominal angle of the stitches in the particular object. It is dependent on stitch angle, but it is always happening. It is different degrees depending on our stabilizer, the ability for us to arrest motion in our design, the motion and the distortion through stabilizer and through the resistance of the fabric. A stretchier fabric will distort more easily. There is also a small amount of distortion that's going to be differentiated by the thickness of the garment. Something that is very thick and soft is going to show more pull distortion, especially because not only is it pulling, it's also sinking into that fabric and kind of pulling away. As we get those shadows on the edge of our satin stitch, it's even more evident. It pulls in, it sinks in, and that gives us more pull distortion. So we have that also making part of this happen. It can be material interactions that make it exactly how it is. And we have our hoop playing into it. The hoop arrests the stretch and the movement of the fabric. Well, if the hoop doesn't arrest it very well, or we have slipping in the hoop, we can have increased pull distortion or push distortion as the fabric is allowed to move more freely. Or as it pulls in, slides in our hoops, especially in rectangular hoops, and slides out of the friction in the hoop. It does not hold, and so we are able to gather that material into that tense angle of the stitches. So pull and push distortion really is predicated, like I said, remember the physicality. It is really predicated on what the stitch is doing. The stitch is pulling tight toward its center. A collection of stitches is rolling off of each other and is spreading apart the fibers in the material. And so it's pushing away. And it is highly, highly determined by the angle of stitches in a particular object. So those are kind of our contributing factors, right? So I've just described all this and I didn't show you very much, but we're going to go into some slides and I'll show you more about it. First, I'm going to grab some comments while we're here. Make sure there's nobody else. Yeah, I know we can't click the link on the forum. I've told you that is on that. Unfortunately, the link might not be clickable in the chat. I will put it in the description, or go back to episode 200 if you're on YouTube. And it's already in the description. Unfortunately, the links not being clickable in chat is kind of weird. It's something I haven't figured out what we can do about that. And unfortunately, I didn't have them in the description ahead of time. I apologize. I can try and get those live if we want to now. But yeah, we'll get further into that. We're going to talk about, like I said, because we're going to talk about all the rest of this stuff, I think what I can do, I'll try and grab you those links really quickly if we can. Throw them in the description on YouTube. Unfortunately, yeah, it is one of those things where this is something I unfortunately can't really fix quite that easily for everybody. It has to be thrown into the description, but the description wasn't allowing the links on all of my platforms. So we'll get that into there as we can during the show. After the show, I'll do it right after we're done recording, so you'll still be able to get those. But let's get into pull and push distortion, right? Let's not go too far into that. We will get links to you. Otherwise, the links are available, and I can share them on social today as well. But the cool thing is, like I'm doing with my other class, I thought I'm just going to teach you guys part of this out of one of my paid classes. So this is some of the material from my paid classes. Pardon me. I'm going to go ahead and drop that back out because the view came in incorrectly. We'll go ahead and grab the view on that and make it a little easier for us to see. But let's go ahead and bring in the material from one of my courses. This is one of my foundational courses, and we're going to bring in some of the slide deck from that. And in this class, it's all about finding your foundations as a digitizer. So we will go ahead and grab that entirely. The thing is, and what I'm going to say, Doug actually brings up a comment. He says, would love a guideline for push-pull compensation, form of a decision tree, type of stitch, satin, tatami length, density, underlay types, and fabric type and thickness. This is what you get from kind of those general assistants. Many assistants are available. A lot of softwares have these assistants, or they have fabric guides that will tell you this stuff. I'm going to be a little controversial and say they're a great guideline, but they are not going to tell you the entirety of what's going on, because though I can give you a guideline that says, hey folks, you generally want about this much pull compensation. The problem is this: if I give you a design that has a ton of fill all in one angle, it's going to pull more and require more compensation than if I give you a design where, yes, maybe it pulls in one angle on one object, but different angles are used throughout the design, so it doesn't line up all over the place. So what I'm going to say is, yes, I can give you numbers. You're going to find that every design is going to be a little bit different, and you're mostly going to do a test stitch and do some of your compensation after that. That's where you're going to hone in on it. But giving you a guideline, I can give you some basic guidelines, which I often do in my classes. However, those basic guidelines really aren't something you can do where it's going to give you everything for every design. It can give you some sort of starting point. The truth of the matter is you're mostly going to adjust based on designs, and unless the designs are pretty similar, you may find some things that are going on that do not line up. It is hard to do this and have it actually play out for somebody for every design. To that point, I'm just going to throw this out there without throwing numbers on screen, because it's something that like I said, this is, to me, it's kind of a throwaway. If you are on a moderately textured knit that's relatively thin, like a PK polo shirt, 0.13 to 0.17 millimeters is a pretty normal kind of pull compensation to be at for most satin stitches, most edges of fill stitches. So right around that, between 0.1 and 0.2, like I said, 0.13, 0.15, 0.17, that's where you're going to see me start. The thing is, as I move through the design and the different forces cause the fabric to move around, that might change. And I'm going to show you an example of why that doesn't hold up. I can give you that and say to you, hey, if you've got one piece, that's a really good place to land. 0.17, especially right in there, you're going to land in a good spot where most of the time, that's the excess you're going to need. That's that, or 1.7 embroidery points is about how much extra you'll need, and it'll pull in about that much. And honestly, it won't be that far. If you're at a density of 0.4 or 4 embroidery points, that's about also how much extra you're going to get top and bottom of that satin stitch or on the fill. Though that can be helpful to you as a starting point, the truth of the matter is, if I run several satin stitches that all run the same direction, and we're always pushing toward one side as we run these satin stitches, I'm going to get increased push toward that direction, because it's also directional as we move through the garment. So unfortunately, it's better to know why it does it the way it does and how to counteract it, and run your first sample, yes, with those great baselines involved, but I'd say that the chart is less valuable than you think it is. You'll develop a sense for it. Yes, it can help somewhat. You will eventually understand that if I'm working on, a big thick sweatshirt, I'm probably going to up that. I'm going to be up in the 0.25 range, sometimes maybe more. I'm going to be up in a higher range of that pull compensation for distortion, but the chances are that you're going to have to make changes based on the design that you're running. A really heavy design with lots of things moving around is more likely to come out of registration, meaning outlines won't land on colors, and will have to be altered based on how that first sample runs. So I'll just be honest and say that it's great to learn this stuff. You're probably not going to hit it every time on the first time. You live and die, as Lisa says, you live and die on that test stitch, on the stitch out. That's where that first stitch out on the material that is similar to what you're doing for your garment is absolutely critical. But let's get back to the slides. Why not? Let's get back to the class materials that we have here. So I will have my cursor so I can draw things and show you stuff. But first thing to show you is just this. Embroidery is naturally distorted. If we're looking at this piece, I'm always going to tell you how much the screen is lying to you. The file that you are seeing on the bottom results in the text that you're seeing on the top. So look how much thicker those lines look. Look how closed the apertures are on this S. Look how much of a gap we have between the top of the T and the top of this L. But then go up here to the stitching and see how much more open the S is. Look how we are pretty well in line, aside from optical compensation on round letters. You want round letters to stick up above and fall below, because the eye tends to see them as shorter because of that mass falling away. Other than that, we can see that N, that I, the T, and the L look like we have a good solid line, though we do see maybe a little interaction with the fabric underneath it that might be pulling that just a little bit. But we can see how different, how humped up some of these letters look, and how much of a camel hump situation we have. As Brian says, this dancing baseline here where it's up and down and up and down. That is the art of compensation. And also it is to reiterate, which I will say repeatedly, that the screen is lying to you, and what is on screen is not supposed to look perfect. If it looks perfect on screen, it will be distorted at the machine. And if we want perfection at the machine, we need to have a mindful distortion, understanding what's going on with our stitches, distorted on screen on purpose. So the thing to remember, like I said, all stitches are going to distort, no matter how dense they are or loose they are. No matter what kind of stitches we have, there is some amount of distortion. More density, more stitches in one area are going to cause more distortion. And also longer satins are going to distort a little bit more as they are under tension, unsupported. And especially depending on garments, it can change. But no matter what stitches you're putting into a garment, it's never an exact copy of what you've created on screen. And what you see on screen is not what you're going to see on the machine. There will be definite visible differences between what's on screen and what's on the machine. Put in the most plain way, I just tell you guys this. The screen lies. The meaner version of this is the screen is lying to you on purpose. It hates you. It wants you to fail. If you trust it, you will suffer. The screen is always lying to us. It's trying to make us fail. It's trying to lull us into a false sense of security. The produce of a digitizer, the produce of the embroiderer, is never what's on a screen somewhere. It is always what it happens in the thread. It is always embroidery. The produce of digitizing is embroidery. The produce is not the file. The file is a step on the way. So screen lies. Get over that. We just know. Like I said, all stitches are also under tension. We know that. They roll off of each other when tightly stacked at the same angle. Just as I described before, they are always going to cause that distortion. But this image is how I often teach it. This is pull and push distortion put in its most simple fashion with satin stitches. Yes, this happens on fills as well. Fills see less pull, because when we're looking at a satin stitch, we have pull distortion, as you see, where the stitch under tension here is pulling toward the center. We have push, which is against that, which is contrary, which is perpendicular to that angle. And we see we're pulling toward the center of our column. We are pushing out toward the ends with a satin stitch. The thing that you're going to notice about filling stitches, because the stitches are stepped, are not arranged in the same angle, that they are not all pulling on the same piece of fabric. Literally, there's different pieces of the fabric they're pulling on. They are stepped and not all in one line. And it means that we have a little bit less of that distortion, because there's some tension that's against itself, against the other stitches in the piece. In a satin stitch, we have one big column of fabric that we are pulling tight. And so you'll see in a satin stitch is going to cause a little more distortion, especially big wide satins on soft materials that stretch, and without heavy stabilization, you're going to find more. However, it's easy to see when we're looking at this TES collection here, what we're talking about. If we want this blue baseline, that's what we're trying to achieve. We know that we have to stop early. That's called push compensation. If we know that push distortion makes the bottom of this capital T push down, then we know the way to stop that is to compensate. We stop early before we get to that line, knowing that it's going to push down to that line. Pull compensation, we can see that if this is supposed to be our baseline here, this blue baseline down here, and we can see that blue line notated here. Well, if we know that this stitch here, this horizontal bar in the E, is going to get thinner, then we want to cast wide. We want to draw or use our pull compensation tools to extend our stitches out beyond the line that we want it to reach. Like I said, if we were sitting here on a piqué polo shirt, that's probably going to be a distance of about 0.17 mils, 0.13 to 0.17. 0.17 probably is where I would land for my base. 0.1 or 0.17, and that would be like 1.7 embroidery points. So 2 points is a pretty normal thing to see on big satin text like that. But we cast wide out past the edge of where we think we want to land with that shape. And then, of course, I put this in here just to show you guys, because people always complain. They're like, the O's look too big, the S's look too big, the G's look too big. Even if you go to an open type or true type font and you put a ruler against it, you drop a guideline and Illustrator on that open type or true type font, you will notice that O's and S's and G's and anything that is rounded will be extra tall and drop below the baseline for optical balance. Our eyes tend to see these pull away. And in fact, another thing I've seen lots of young embroiderers do, which causes them great consternation, is they will essentially grab their text and they'll grab the O, the G's, whatever, smash them all down to the height and drop their baseline and feel very satisfied with themselves that they've done that. And then they're going to find out that even next to other stitches in the same angle, those O's look really tiny, the G's look really tiny. Also, imagine that we're all pulling toward the center of that rounded object and we're getting a lot of distortion that tends to suck into that middle. It is going to cause those to look very short and not to balance optically. So that's just a thing where the eye fools us as we pull away these little wedges, as you can see here in that space between the E and the S. As it pulls away, we kind of see that as shorter because the first time we encounter that letter going left to right or right to left, depending on your language, you will encounter that letter kind of below the line of that top point. So we make those a little bit larger because optically to the eye, it looks more balanced if we do. But that's the thing to remember. This is the basic nature of all stitches. They pull, gathering material and narrowing along the stitch angle. So here's our stitch angle in this column. It's going to get narrower. Same here. It's vertical on that top column. It's going to get shorter. And they push, extending and pushing material away. So you're also going to see ripples of material sometimes as it pushes that material, as it displaces it away from the ends, extending objects perpendicular to the stitch angle. That is pull and push distortion put in its most basic form. And push compensation, we stop short before we want that end to be. Pull compensation, we cast wide, we draw things wider. The edge is further out than we expect it to be. And then, of course, with round lettering, it is just its own thing that optical balance exists. But really, when we're talking about the stuff we want to know, it is stop short, cast wide. And that, yes, I'm showing you in satin stitches. It is the most basic thing. So, like I said, Lisa says, question I get in the class of beginners on the T, you have the stitching down and showing the compensation. What if you were stitching up? Still happens because it's rolling off. It's not stitching down directionally. And in fact, if we're looking at this T, and I'll just kind of draw it with my cursor so you can see it, I would be starting here. I'm going to stitch up, and then I'm going to back over to here, and I'm going to stitch over. And though you will see in the apparent motion a little bit more push toward the side you're moving toward, you will still see as you stack this up to full density, no matter which direction you're going, you're still going to see stitches get taller. It's still going to push out beyond the line that you start in. So it's not, though I say up or down, it's not just directional as in the apparent motion of the needle. We know the fabric moves, not the needle. It's not just the apparent motion of the needle. It is also just literally the direction. Even if I started in the middle and went up and then jumped and went down, you are still going to see it. Or I went toward the middle. The only thing is, if you went toward the middle, I would also see a pinch of the fabric toward the middle, because when you move toward an existing stitched object, you're pushing fabric that direction. There are two things really going on here. There's the rolling off, the spreading of the material and the rolling off that we talk about. And then there is the directional tension, which is where we've got that needle and we keep piercing, and the fabric's not relaxing in time as we keep moving in one direction. It wants to push in that direction of the apparent motion of the machine. So Lisa, excellent question on that, and something that's a little more complicated, but is something worth knowing. If you are constantly moving in one direction, also same thing when we have hats, and people say you want to center out on hats, that left to right motion, why we get that horrible wave, is also partially, yes, it's from the distortion of the hat and the crushing down of the crown, but there's also some part of it that is that continuous pushing in one direction without letting the cap release itself and relax into place. And honestly, because we're stitching down stabilizer in that direction, continuing to push in that one direction. So it's not just the movement, it is just literally the spreading out of fibers and the stacking and rolling of thread that at least as we understand it. So let's get further into it. Like I said, I don't know how far we're going to go. We might go into stitch interactions if I can, if I feel like it's worth it to keep the time up, but we'll first just go through basic push and pull distortion and compensation and kind of get ourselves on board with these concepts. The real simplified way of understanding it here is this, and let me get myself back out of the way of the arrows here. If we want to see this red column, if we want to see that, then we need to draw this blue column. Does that make sense? Right? We draw this knowing that it's going to extend out in the angle of push, and in the stitch angle, it's going to pull in. So if we want to see this red column, we want to draw something more like this blue column. Now, yes, it is highly variable depending on the size of the design, the garment, and all of that can influence it. But we know that if our satin stitch is not wider, so along the length, wider, the stitch angle, the length of the stitches, if they are not longer than they should be, wider than they should be, and if it is not, if we haven't stopped the ends before where we want them to eventually be, if we haven't done that, we know that we will have something that is, like I said, thinner and taller. It will stick out too far in the ends. It'll be narrower than we intended it to be. So if on screen we don't see something that's slightly distorted, we aren't going to get what we want on the machine. Just bar none, that's what's going to happen every time. No questions. The shapes we draw on screen must be distorted intentionally or compensated for pull and push distortion to ensure we're getting the outcome we expect. It is as simple as that. And it seems more complicated than this, but I'm going to tell you, when you get to fixing these problems, you can look at something that you have stitched, measure the difference from what you expected, and go back to your software and add that distance as long as you change nothing else about how the material runs, about what you've done with your tension, what you've done with your stabilizer, the material itself, the machine, the speed. If you haven't changed anything else, you can literally say, I am off by 1 millimeter here. I have added that millimeter back into the length, width, what have you, that's missing or that is extra. And when you run it, it will go to the place you expect it to be. Even though on screen it will look terrible, it will look distorted, it will not look like what you expect it to. You have to understand that the embroidery is going to cause distortion as it runs. This is a given. This is a 100% thing. Will there be differences depending on how you put it together and structure it and what materials you're on? Yes, but there will always be some kind of distortion. And that first run, that sample run, which, yes, my company sampled everything we ever did, especially if there was a change. That sample run is going to give you the final notes on the outcome that gives you the chance to change things. This is really especially evident to see in satin stitch text. Top lines and base lines are going to look distorted on screen, but even in stitches. Once again, you can see we've got that, the short UNI, the T looks tall, the E looks tall, but when we get into this piece, it is very much the same distance away from that patch edge on this piece. Push and pull are usually on the same materials, on the same stack, on the same machine, at the same speed. They are going to be pretty uniform and repeatable. So that's the thing, though. Compensation, however, lots of people ask me this because their software has a compensation variable. They're like, all right, well, then how much compensation do I add? The truth of the matter is it is not just a software variable. It is also about how we draw our shapes. So part of what we're going to be doing to get our compensation is in the drawing. And especially depending on the software you have, the chances are all softwares are going to have pull compensation, but not all software has push. They expect you to draw your columns and your shapes in such a way that they will distort into the shape that you want. Compensation is lovely as a variable, but it's more than that. You often have to draw things in. Once again, here's our base lines that I was talking about before. Here's pull compensation. Stitches pull in from the edges. Digitizer is lengthening them to compensate the column. Like I said, 0.13 to 0.2 millimeters is a very normal amount to lengthen something. But the reason I put this up here is this is on patch material. That is on a polyester twill that you're looking at here. And even on a polyester twill, the original one was 3.02 millimeters wide. And when I stitched it out, it came out around 2.6, 2.8 millimeters. I am lacking that thickness. Now, in this case, it's not that much. It is not a very large amount that's off, but even on the most ironclad material that does not stretch, that has stabilization to it, that is not likely to pull, there's always a little bit of difference despite the fact that we look like we're at 3 mils on screen. It's always going to happen no matter what material you're on. Now, admittedly, we've got a question here from Barb, and I'll go ahead and say, she says, define that thin fabrics or slippery fabrics can cause more distortion. Yes. If it stretches more easily, it will compress more easily. It absolutely will. And if you don't then have your stabilizer set up in such a way that arrests that stretch, keeps it from stretching so much, or if you're using a stabilizer that has a grain to it, woven stabilizers, they are often even woven, the action stabilizers, meaning that if you look at these, they are strong in one vertically because you're pulling on a thread vertically. They're strong horizontally because you're pulling on a thread horizontally, or you're trying to compress that. But if you have only one layer on the 45s, you have this angle where there are no threads, and you can just deform these things. You can stretch them on that 45 degrees. We might talk about that again in a moment as I talk about shape distortion, meaning that you need 2 layers of any of those woven stabilizers. You have to have one, and then you have another one that you turn 45 degrees so that you cover all of your angles. That's why most stabilizers have fibers that are wet laid and non-directional. You don't see any direction in them. They're not woven or knit. Because that means that any direction you pull or push or try and move that material, it doesn't want to move because there's a fiber going in that direction. So yeah, really it's about that and stabilization. Tissue tees, super thin stuff, performance wear, slippery materials. Also, if your hoop is not tensioned correctly, or something that I'm probably going to talk about again in a second if we get time, if you have a rectangular hoop or another kind of hoop that has home hoops especially are like this, and I've got a rectangular home hoop within reach here to show you, though my focus went out on that. On these, you can even see it just by me moving it back and forth. While it's here, it's harder for it to move in the corners, and that's where all the tension is. If I push on this thing, yeah, it pops out, hits my desk, but as it's moving, you can see that it holds on in the corners. All of the tension in a hoop like this, all of the friction is really in the corners, and the sides are very loose and move very easily apart from each other. So what you end up with is if your stitch angle is along the vertical or the horizontal, you're going to see that fabric slips on these sides. On traditional compression hoops like this, on ring hoops that are horizontal, they lose tension in the sides. That is one of those things that can also cause extra problems. You have really long satin stitches horizontally on a piece like that. They're big, long satins. They're going to try and compress, or multiple rows of overlap satins. They're going to try and compress that, or even fills, a big chunk of fill that is all in the horizontal or all in the vertical. On a hoop like that is going to want to pull in the weakest angle of the hoop. Same thing with material, and unfortunately I didn't get material in my hands to do it. If you have material that's woven in even weave, most of that material you're going to find is really weak on the 45-degree angles, where it's strong when you pull the material this direction, it's strong when you pull it this direction, vertical or horizontal. But if you grab it on the 45 degrees on the bias, it will stretch, even though it's a fairly strong material. You're going to find that also can play into it somewhat. And actually, Lisa brings something up that is worthwhile to say as well. Lisa says, big hoops have more movement. Yeah. Well, a really large hoop, you have to think about it. A large rectangular hoop like that, especially those home style large rectangular hoops, and even the commercial ones, that they're just a press fit hoop. It's 2 rings, right? The classic hoop style, not a magnetic. Magnetics have magnets all around the outside edge, which makes the tension even. But if a standard jacket back style hoop, you think about the fact that you only have a little tiny bit of area on that hoop that's causing friction, or very much friction. The tightest friction is in the corners, and the long sides and bottom of that hoop are going to be looser, and they're going to pull looser all the time. So when we see that, if our stitch angle lines up in a meaningful way with either the weakest angle of the hoop, if it's not tense all around the sides, why you see people putting clips and clamps all over these jacket back hoops to keep them together, or if it's in the weakest angle of the material. Let's say we are trying to not over stabilize a piece of performance wear, but it has a real bias, or even a very light piece of shirting, a piece of woven that has that real bias to it, the weakness in the bias on the 45s, a 45-degree angle from the weave. You'll find that if you have a big 45-degree angle fill, it will pull on that and really make that more noticeable. You'll see that in shape distortion, something I'm going to show you in a moment. But yeah, stitches are always going to pull. They're always going to pull. And I'll answer one more question before I get back to this. We have a question from Cindy King saying, do you think the hoop world, home or commercial, will ever go straight magnetic? I'm seeing more and more people go magnetic when they first buy their machines. The The thing I'm going to say though is a standard commercial round hoop is awesome. A circular hoop has even tension all the way around it. A circular 15-centimeter hoop is still a great choice for a left chest design. There's nothing wrong with it, aside from the fact that the compression can cause hoop burn. If you guys don't know, hoop burn is where you overcompress or slide the hoops together. And when they clink together, when they push together, you'll get a ring, a shine, or a ring, a halo on your garment. That's something that you can avoid by not using a compression hoop, a standard style hoop. But otherwise, standard round hoops are great. Big round hoops are great. A fully round hoop has tension all the way around the edges. It's definitely the rectangular hoops that cause more problem, and certainly depending on the materials that are slippery, satins, things like that, satins and acetate jackets, old school coaches jackets from back in the day, they're horrible. And also multiple layer garments. If you have a garment that is lined and you have multiple layers in there in the hoop and the layers slip from each other, that slippage can also cause distortion to be more pronounced. Most of the time we see that in outlines not lining up over time. It's why you'll see people run a design where it's really big on a jacket back and they run a little bit in one area and they move to another area, even though they have to repeat colors, they kind of isolate areas. That is to keep those garments from sliding apart from each other, either especially line garments, but just keeping designs from moving in big hoops, because we are doing something very physical. We're pulling on that garment, we're tapping on it, we're putting it under tension. It's going to move. And the more we go away from an area and then back to it, the more likely it is that it has shifted somewhat in the hoop by the time we get back. And though we're trying to arrest a lot of that shifting through stabilization and hooping correctly, you can't avoid it all. It's also why there are overlaps that allow for a little bit of play between things that are supposed to be in contact with each other. Objects, you'll see a little bit of overlap, so that if there's just a little bit of movement, that's okay. If there's a little bit of pull, but we don't pull entirely apart, that's okay. Then our borders haven't come free from the things that they are tracing the edges of, then that's normal. That's what we're trying to do. That's also compensation. And we'll talk about that a little bit if we can get to it. This might be a longer thing. We might have to do a 2-part on this one, and we'll see. That might also be what we do next week, and then we'll do the patch follow-up the following week, which lets everybody get a chance to watch that super long class if they want to. Let's get back to this and see how far we can get. Once again, this is all about measurement, and we'll talk about this again later. But when we see something, as long as we don't change anything materially about how we're doing the work, if we see that we're off by an amount in the real world, we can add that amount back. So if I am at 2.8 millimeters here and I want that 3 millimeters, if I go back into my software and add 0.2 millimeters of width to that column, when I go back and run it in the same fashion as I already had, it'll be the right thickness. It'll be 3 millimeters over here. What we lack in the real world, we add back in our software, and it should come out the way we want it to. But that's compensation. It's exactly what it sounds like. You missed by that much, you compensate by that much, and now you hit it. So compensation is really just that. It didn't land where we wanted to. We need to move it or extend it or in some fashion alter it so that the edge will land where we want it to. That's really what we're talking about, compensation. Pull distortion, like I said, without sufficient overlaps, objects will pull short of their borders as well. Same thing happening here. If you just meet the edge, we see that this is the nominal stitch angle of this fill, and then we have this stitch angle here in the satin stitch. As this satin stitch gets thinner and as this pulls in the angle of the fill, they have pulled apart from each other and we have a gap. Distortion. Also, we can see that these are moving. These big paths of fill are moving the garment around, and we're seeing some other distortion and some pull and push distortion that's causing things to go out of line in other ways. And that's more about the motion, stuff like this where it's shifted all to one side. That's the motion of the entire piece. However, in this case, we can counteract pull distortion here and still get what we want. Items that meet in the plane that their stitches will pull. So as we see here, we have one piece coming in around 15-degree angle here. We have another that's fully horizontal, but the horizontal one's going to pull in the horizontal angle. That one's going to pull in the 15, and they're pulling away from each other. Where they're going to pull away from each other, we want a nice deep overlap. Satin stitches, you're going to see if I've got two satin stitches next to each other, as long as I'm not building up too much bulk, like I haven't done a ton of embroidery on the same area, I'm going to have at least half of that distance covered. And if it's starting to pull apart like you see, even though it looks crazy, I'll have that thing overlapped more than halfway. And point of fact, on thin satin stitches, it can sometimes be that I have a fill stitch that looks like it is blown out the other direction past the entire border. That's the thing. Even though it looks crazy, if reliably, as I run a couple samples, I'm having that design end up where my satin stitch is not hitting on the border and I'm missing by that entire distance, sometimes I will have to lengthen out the stitches in that fill, or I will have to move the edge of that fill stitch block over beyond that gap, even if it looks like I'm completely overshooting it in my software. What's happening on the screen is not what's important. We don't care that it looks weird on the screen, provided it is stitching out reliably on the machine. So you can measure any gaps between your border and background, and you move your background stitching, in this case, the fill background, further than the width of the observed gap. Don't be afraid to deeply inset these elements. People worry about overlap. They worry about this bulk that's being built up, especially when we have a couple layers of stitching. Even 3 layers of stitching is not going to build up too much bulk. It's not going to cause problems. And moreover, what you're going to find is where we have more problems with the material moving around and getting stiff is where there are tons of penetration points all lining up. As long as we don't have all the penetrations from the stitch points lining up and all in the same space, we're going to find it's not a big deal. Overlapping is not the deal that people think it is. It's not as heavy as you think it is at normal densities. And especially one layer of satin on top of one layer of fill, don't be afraid of that at all. That is not something to cut out or try and remove. And in fact, in cutting out or removing it, you will absolutely cause a gap. Because if it just meets on screen, it will miss. Some of the most visible compensation, however, is satins with straight stitch borders because you can't really hide that overlap. If we look at this piece here, this is a wing tip from a cap. I actually showed you guys this last week. It was the cap where it goes over the mesh. And in this wing, you're going to see that we have a fairly massive gap in that vertical. It's almost 0.5 millimeter that goes out. But you'll see over here in the real sample, that straight stitch border exactly hits the edge of that piece. On that big trucker hat where we've got a lot of movement and it's crushing down on that crown and especially into the mesh where there's not a lot holding it up, aside from its underlay, we had to put a lot of compensation on it, almost 0.5 millimeter. In fact, it's a little more than 0.5 millimeter, 0.56 mils. So we have that. Also, you'll see the end, we have push compensation. You'll see how there's this gap. You'll see this little black gap between the end of that border. If you look over here, it's not perfectly clear here, but if you look at this piece, it's just hitting. That border is just hitting the tip of that wing, and it's just riding along the edge perfectly. That tells you that we lost that much pull, and we had that much push. The wingtip extended out like this, and it pulled in this angle. And we do that purposefully as we're running our designs. So that's what we're looking for. Same thing happens with fills, push distortion. We're looking at this piece, these cherries here, without sufficient gaps. Those objects will push behind the borders. The nominal angle on these cherries, it's on a denim hat, is horizontal here. And we can see that we're pushing out. The red is pushed out beyond this border and shading on the bottom, and it's pushed out here as well. So here's the angle. In the angle of pull, we're pretty well compensated. We're hitting this straight stitch outline really nicely. But in the angle of push, which is perpendicular to the fill angle, so the fill angle is horizontal, push angle is vertical, we pushed up about 2 lines of thread, about 2 rows on both the top and the bottom, meaning that we've got push distortion happening. We don't have sufficient gaps. And so you're going to see they're going to push toward those open ends. Same thing here. We're seeing this piece. This is from the Sundari Imports design that I've done. I can show you the whole thing later, but this is a left chest design. And here's this woman who has a satin stitch fingers here. We can see that her fingers line up exactly with that straight stitch border. But if we look here at this design, as we were pushing up, running all of the satin stitches in the fingers and the hands, we kept pushing and pushing, and we ended up needing a gap of 0.3 millimeters in order for that to work. Now, this is on a piqué polo shirt. That's what it was run on. But I said previously that 0.2 is pretty normal. Well, in this case, I needed almost 0.33, like a little over 0.3 millimeters of gap or 3 embroidery points in order to let those fingers not push past the borders. The great thing is sometimes you can literally just count it. You know, you can either measure the excess if it pushes out past that border, or you can count the lines of stitching kind of lazily. You can say, all right, looks like about 2 lines have gone past the border. I'm going to grab the 2 points at the end of my satin stitch column, and I'm going to grab them in and just pull them in by those 2 densities, those 2 lines of stitching. Or I can delete. If I'm in a stitch-based file, I may be able to. I have to watch where that next stitch gathers up from there. Like if we're jumping to the next finger, I need to see where I'm exiting that finger on that satin stitch. But if I've got a couple of stitches that are poking out past my outline, I can literally just go in and delete those couple of stitches and go back behind the outline by the amount that I am going outside of it in the initial test stitch. So like I said, from that sample, you can measure the excess, or you can count the lines of push. So as we see it, it's the same thing in these cherries where we have that push escaping on the top and bottom. 2 rows of fill are escaping the top and bottom, pulling in the top and the bottom edges by about 0.4 millimeters or 4 embroidery points. You grab the points that you use to draw that and drag it in, or you delete those rows if you have to. And it's a simple fix to pull those together. You delete those rows that are sticking out top and bottom, or you grab those lines if you digitize it yourself and pull it in. But what I'm going to tell you is on screen, I know that this was exactly matched right to the edge of that cherry. When I pulled in those lines, now there were gaps above and below the fill of the cherry between that and the border. And on screen, it's going to look like it has gaps. This is the long and short of it. When you're talking about multiple colors in registration, edges that meet exactly on screen will miss in the thread. The other thing we have often, and this is probably where we're going to end most of this discussion, but this is the one that stymies people the worst, is probably shape distortion. And it's something you're actually seeing. Let's go back to our cherries you're seeing here. Each one of these cherries is roughly kind of a round shape, but you can see where they should be fairly round and squat. What do we have? We have an oval. They stick out past those borders, top and bottom. Well, that is what I call shape distortion, right? Because we have those pull and push forces always acting on any shape, they're going to lead to shapes shrinking in the angle of pull and growing in the angle of push. So here's the thing that causes people the greatest amount of trouble when they're digitizing. They want a perfect circle. And so they take their circle tool and they draw a perfect circle and drag it into existence, and the circle exists as if summoned from the platonic solids out there in space. The perfect circle is now here. And once we have our perfect circle, we fill it with stitches, and then we're happy. We're like, we start at the bottom, we're going to end at the top, and here's our horizontal stitch angle. And now I've made a perfect circle of stitches. And when I run it out, my golf ball, my softball, my sun, whatever this rounded thing is supposed to be, will appear as a perfect circle. But the truth of the matter is, we're still dealing with push and pull. So what do we have? It's going to push toward the top and bottom because this is a horizontal stitch angle. It's going to pull on the left and the right, meaning that I've made an egg. I now have my oval. If you want a circle, you have to draw the oval contrary to that pull. And here's where I get to tell on myself and show you guys that Eric was not always a good digitizer. Here's an ugly, ugly design that I did early on in my career. And we can see the evidence of all these troubles. That is supposed to be a circle. And we can see also that the lettering maintained relatively circular pathway, right? But here's a couple things I've done. Number one, oh man, I tried to line up that rounded C without optical balance, and look how small it looks now. Terrible. My O is small, my C is small, because I didn't understand optical balance. Oh man, I didn't even do push and pull here. The top of this bar is short, and the V and the I are pushing out beyond it, and the A pushing out beyond it. So I'm not really working with push and pull yet. I didn't know this. This is really, really early in my career. And we can see that the nominal angle of this piece is this kind of angle you're seeing me trace here. And along that angle of the fill, over here on the left and right, what can you see? It's splitting away from my borders because I ran the border after the fill and the fill was distorted. And what do you see? We see the distance up here and down here away from the text and that circle that was supposed to be there extending. I now have an oval. I have a tilted oval because I tried to draw a perfect circle that had a slight angle to the fill. If you draw a perfect circle, you will get the egg. You will have an oval. You have to draw the oval. You counteract this by purposefully drawing shapes that are distorted in the angles of push and pull. And this is the correction that we're looking for. If we are dealing with this stitch angle, we know we're going to have to extend out on both sides. We're going to have to stop short on the top and bottom. I'm saying top and bottom here in reference to this fill angle, right? At the ends of the fill, the sides of our stitches, we're going to have to pull it in by the amount that we're out of round. And in the angle of the fill, we're going to have to extend it out. Swing wide, extend beyond the line in the amount that we see ourselves losing as we run the piece. This is going to happen. If we do this on the weakest angle of fabric, which often is the case, if you do it on 45 degrees, you can even see it more, a more extended version where it's more exaggerated. So you correct it in the circle by measuring the deviation between your stitch out and the circle in the art. If it was a perfect circle in the art, we can see, oh man, I was off by, heck, it might be terrible. It might be a couple millimeters or 3 millimeters. Well, that means I'm going to have to go 1.5 millimeters down here, 1.5 millimeters down here. And then if it's 3 millimeters the other direction, well, I need to extend out to the left and to the right by about 1.5 millimeters so that in the end, when all of this stress happens, because I'm not going to change anything else on the machine, that we end up stitching the oval. We end up stitching that oval, and as it pulls and pushes, the circle appears. We stop short, we swing wide, and the distortion brings it into the shape that we want it to be. And so that's the same thing here with this particular piece. Is another one of my very early pieces. So I get to torture my inner child, considering I was literally underage the first time I did any embroidery, and I was a teenager when I did most of my early work. We'll torture him a little bit more and say, here's one of his attempts at a piece for Loveless Hospitals. This is not supposed to be a rhombus. This is supposed to be a square. This is not supposed to stretch out like this. And we've got a couple interesting things to see about it. Number one, our nominal angle here is 45 degrees. So I was trying to stop the material from tearing out the top and bottom. When fill stitches interact with borders, they often pull the fill stitches apart. If they meet in that angle where a horizontal stitch has a vertical satin border, it'll pull it apart. And I didn't want those gaps. So I thought, I'm smart. I'm going to throw a 45-degree angle on that whole gigantic fill, this whole 3-inch square. Well, once at full density on a fairly stretchy material, on the weakest angle in the material, I'm really getting a lot of pull here, and we're getting a shortening in the angle of the fill, and we're getting a lengthening in the push angle. So perpendicular to the angle of the fill. And this can be even more so on materials where there's a really weak bias. So what are we dealing with again? You need to watch that angle. Some people love to throw that 45-degree angle around, but it is the most common weak angle on fabric. So I really would not mess with a 45-degree angle unless it is artistically what you want for a reason. And understand that if you have a large piece of fill or a really big satin that is all in that angle, in that 45, there's a high chance of you getting extra distortion that you're going to have to compensate for. Could you compensate for this? Yeah, you totally could. You could compensate for this amount of stretch, but you're also going to see more fabric interruption, more moving around and stretching and puckering of fabric when you do it. So I tend to just stick with lower angles. As you see here, 15 degrees will still combat that splitting at the top and bottom edge that you would see if this was a horizontal fill without having all that excess strain on the fabric. But once again, you can see I'm going to have to compensate because we're having this problem where it's getting shorter here and extending out. And in fact, the other thing I want to show you right here, if you see this little yellow dot, and I'll put myself into the screen a little bit so it gets even a little bit bigger. You see that little yellow dot that's in the corner here? People will often see that and think, oh, it's a trim, it's a knot, it's something else. What's actually happening here is I've drawn a perfect square, and that perfect square has little tiny stitches going up into the corner. And as it stacks those little stitches together and we get pretty close to the midpoint of that line, we have so much push in this 45-degree angle. That's actually the fill coming to a point and pushing out. And it didn't quite do it down here. We didn't get just exactly that amount because we do have a little bit of interaction with it all pushing from this bottom corner toward the upper right-hand corner, which is done, like I said, as the apparent motion of the fill, apparent motion of the needle through the fill. There is a little bit more emphasis in that motion. However, we do see that I stretched out beyond the edge of that border because I'm just having that incredible amount of push. And because I drew that little sharp corner that has all these little tiny stitches trying to fill that sharp corner as we get out to the edge of that fill. And that's something that can also be counteracted through cropping those corners down. So material impact can also cause that problem with shape distortion. And even so, you still want to have considerable overlaps in the border. But you can see the points of this fill can be cropped. I'm going to show you what that looks like really quickly. And then I'll show you a little bit about these fills coming together on screen. But just to show you kind of what I mean by cropping a point, even if we do have a fill that we're going up to, we go up to this corner, you're going to see that as you stitch up into corners, you often see a bunch of little stitches trying to fill a corner. In the start, you get a bunch of little bitty stitches. And then as we get to the edge of a square or something like that nature, we get these really short stitches as it tries to maintain the stitch angle toward the point. You can actually stop and crop a fill at the angle of the fill itself. You just stop and take the point off and make the end of the fill end on the angle in the border of the fill shape itself. And then we don't get these little tiny stitches, but I'm going to show you what that does. Essentially, it goes into that corner and pushes into place. So I'm actually going to bring up, let me go ahead and pull myself out of the screen for a second here, and we're going to bring up a fill to show you what I'm talking about when we're talking about that cropping, because it is something that I found I do a little uniquely, or at least I'm someone who does this kind of on autopilot. Not everybody does. But I'll show you why and how. It's because I don't like the fills sometimes pushing out, and avoiding all those little tiny stitches in the corners of fills is just one more place where you can have thread breaks and shredding and stuff like that. Little bitty stitches, short stitches, tiny stitches are always the most likely to cause a thread break or to cause a weird generation on fills. We go down to really sharp points on a fill, trying to fill real small areas if we don't need to. It just is more likelihood that we're going to generate weird stitches or really short stitches. And those, even if they're filtered out, there's more of those in those points that I think are necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that back up on screen and show you. We're here in Stitch Artist. This is Stitch Artist 3, but honestly, it could be any of the Stitch Artists that have this. So really, Stitch Artist 2 would be similar, or 1, you'd see this. But I'm going to show you kind of the difference. If we look at the fill here on this left-hand square, and this has kind of heavy underlay, maybe more than it needs. But as we go up into the final stitches of this fill, you'll see that I'm getting, and I'm going to turn on the penetration points. As we get up into the final stitches of this fill, and I can actually run into that if I can get that started, you'll see that we start to get really small stitches through here. And it's unnecessarily small stitches just to fill in this little corner. But here's the thing. Now we're making all these little small stitches in here. And if we look at our grid, you know, we are, this is a millimeter from this line to this line. So we're making some 0.3, 0.2 millimeter stitches in here. They're really very small, right? They're very small. They can cause problems. That's the most likely we're going to have an issue or a knot or a break. And if we look at the final design, we actually pull out and say, here's the design itself. We go ahead and run through everything and have all of our borders on it. We have this really deep inset. Those stitches that are in that short corner are never going to be seen. Even if this pulls in by 0.2 millimeters on both sides, this border is going to cover that area. You're never going to see those stitches, and there's no reason to make your machine do them. While you are drawing, I tend to like to crop my points. You can see here. So instead of just saying I crop them, this is where and how. When I get to a corner like this, I know that I'm going to be pushing perpendicular to the angle of the fill. This is my 15-degree fill, or 165 in this case. And we have this fill here. It's going to be pushing in this direction. Well, I know that once I hit the corner of this border, that last spot right before the corner of the border, I know if I stop here, it's going to push into the border. That corner will keep going a little bit further beyond that because that's the direction of push. So I can go ahead and take this piece and crop it down to where I just hit the same angle as the nominal angle of the fill. And so when I stop, I don't keep going into those little tiny corners. I stop here. I end up stopping right where it needs to just fill that corner out and not have those little bitty stitches up into the corner, and overlapped also often with small stitches that end up in corners depending on where the start and stop point is on the border. So it does, I think it's worthwhile to do. And when you have something like the other piece I showed you where you have a real sharp corner and you've got a big amount of fill where you're moving in one direction, that cropping is much more likely to keep you from having stitches poke out of those corners when you do have an angle on a fill. So I'll just kind of show you what I'm talking about. We'll go ahead and grab this piece if I can. Hopefully like I said, the screen refresh when you're streaming is not awesome. So it's going to look like I'm a drunken sailor over here a little bit. Truth of the matter is it sometimes can look like that. What I'll say is I kind of find that last line of stitching where it's interacting with that border. I go up from that last line and say, all right, I have a point about here that I've added. I double clicked it in the Stitch Artist. That lets me add it. Then I can drag my line here down until I get closer. In fact, my stitch points should be on while I'm doing that. I drag it down until I get to the nominal angle of the fill right about there. And now you can see that I'm going to stop that fill right before it gets to the border. And then I don't have that corner. So that's really all I do to crop those things. And honestly, most of the time while I'm drawing, I will draw that cropped corner on it. And it does just make it a little bit nicer to run, and it keeps you from having those points that pop out. Just to show you a couple more things on this really quickly. I'm going to show you what I was talking about as far as those corner, the tearing out. If we look at this fill, there's a fully horizontal fill with a border. You're going to see that all of the points on this border line up along one line of stitching. When those pull in under tension, they can make a split right here. That's why people do tend to angle their fills at that 45, but you don't need to go super high angle. 15 degrees is enough. And you'll just see that as each one of these lands, it's in different rows of this underlying fill, so it doesn't pull it apart and cause gaps. The other thing to show you is We're talking about compensation. When people auto-convert vectors, and this is often the case, you have a border and a vector, and they're perfectly matched. You have this line that's on the edge. It's exactly the edge line of the border. You'll see that though these look on screen like they're going to meet, right? Looks like this border is going to come out perfectly. Well, when this pulls in just a little bit and the other one pulls in just a little bit, well, we immediately are going to have a gap. Even though it looks on screen like it might be fine, we are going to have a gap along every edge on the inside of this border, even though on screen it looks like it's going to meet and be happy. Things we can do to fix that, obviously, is to draw the shape in such a way, and I'm just going to pull the entire shape since I have a simple shape here, so that it overlaps into into the border deeply, and that's something that we can do, especially this really simple square. It's easy just to grab that. Usually I'm going to do that by grabbing the points of the piece, so I've got a couple points that are there to draw from. If I'm using those points, then I can grab the points in the shape and drag those along. But the other thing I'm going to show you is if you have software that does it, like in Brilliance Enthusiast, if you're somebody who's not digitizing, but you have a piece that is already in stitches, let's say I have a stitch selection on, I can, on a piece like this, I can select a certain number of those stitches or the edge of a border, and I'll do it on the outside edge to make it a little bit more easy to see. I can grab the edges of a border and use a compensate slider just to move those ones out. And in this case, I wouldn't want to do it on the satins. I would want to do it here. So what I'll actually do is, this is my satin border. I'm going to go ahead and lock my satin border so I don't actually accidentally select it. Then I'm going to go back down to my fill here, and you're going to see me select just the edge of that fill. Now, this is specifically in Enthusiast, certainly, so it's not in every software. Not every software is going to have this. But let's say I am in this particular software, and I'm going to grab my fill stitches here, and you can see that, oops, sorry, folks. I clicked on that. Like I said, the refresh rate is slow, so I'm zipping all over. If I grab my ability to select stitches, and I grab just the stitches that are on the edge of this piece, you can see once those are selected, if I can get those without selecting extra stuff, you can see that just those edge stitches are selected. And if I use my compensation slider, I can slide the edge of that border under that piece. And it won't always look the best on all stitch-based pieces. So if you buy a stock design, you might have to watch what that does if you slide that over. But you can now see that I have a nice, healthy overlap between the two, where that edge is now much further under, and that's stitch by stitch. Otherwise, if you have a really complicated edge, it can get really annoying to grab and drag individual stitches. You most likely need to have a digitizer help you with that. Also, just to kind of show you a couple more things, this is that Sundari Imports design that I showed you earlier. I can show you a better image of it, but I just want to show you once again, as we get to those fingers, that really fairly large gap that's there. The satin stitches all run up toward that gap, and you can see that I have this gap between those, the borders, the straight stitch or running stitch borders, and the satin stitches that are there. So that really is there for that push compensation, right? So like I said, this is stuff that is pretty similar no matter where you are, no matter what kind of work you're doing. I will say one other thing people have told me is that for fills, they like to use a multi-layer fill to counteract it. Nothing against people wanting to do that to try and keep less pull on there. Lighter layers of fill can counteract a little bit of pull and push compensation, but it doesn't erase it. Stitches are still under pull. There is still going to stack up to full density and push. It will do less of that directional push. Remember, I said that if you keep on moving in one direction at full density, it will push toward one direction more than the other. It will lighten that up, but I want to show you something about that. Building up to densities with multiple layers of fill can cause something you might not expect, which is a weird texture in your fills, depending on your software. So I'm going to show you this real quickly and just say, yes, multi-layer fills exist. I'll show you what we're talking about. You use multiple layers of light fill in the same area. In this case, you can see this. There's a single layer fill done standard top to bottom. Here is a triple, I believe. So 2 layers is 1/3 density, and then 1/3 density. And here's a double layer fill, half density, half density. You can do that. However, you're probably already noticing on screen something happening here. When we do a standard fill, it has a standard fill texture. If I put the embroidery points on, you'll see that those points are offset on every row. On most softwares, if you have multiple layers, and as you see, this is done with 2 layers. If I grab this piece and let me move that back to where it was, I can grab the individual fills and say this is the same shape copied twice, done in 2 layers. Yes, it overlaps, but as you can see with the points turned on, even now you'll see that texture is starting to look weird. Well, why is that? Look at my embroidery points on every row. We're getting the same stepping from row to row. So what happens is with 2 layers, I have 2 lines that are lining up on each of these pieces. So we end up with these things that look like a doubled stitch, and suddenly we have this very brick-like pattern because we're getting the stitch penetrations to line up. So if you're doing a 3-layer fill, even more so, we go into our 3-layered fill here, and I'm going to bring this into the center so I can actually zoom into it a little tighter. I must have a small hoop on, but let's go into my 3-layer fill, and you can see that each one of these rows will have 3 lined up right on top of each other. And because of the curvature on the outside edge, we actually have some weird artifacts that are happening that are making this very wavy, puckered kind of element go on. And it really depends on how your software calculates fills. But for us, you'll see that because we have every row is lined up for each 3 of these, we have 3 in a row on each piece, we end up with some really weird patterns coming out. And you can try and avoid them by changing your patterns or your stitch lengths or offsets, but you will often see that instead of getting this super clean single row fill pattern, you get these brick-like patterns, these thick stitch looking patterns from layering multiple fills. So that's just one of those things I wanted to bring up. It doesn't mean it's not a way you can do it, but it does mean that that's one of the issues that can crop up. Texture can be affected by your stepping in your fills. Yes, it does reduce some of that oval shape pulling and pushing. Not enough for me to necessarily want to do it if I'm going to get weird texture. Texture is super important to me in my embroidery, so I don't like that. Though, like I said, even in more complex pieces, you're going to see all these similar things playing out, right? You're going to see that if I have a fill stitch up against a satin, no matter curved fill or long fill, long stitch fill, loose fills, you're going to see that same overlap. I'm going to overlap into my satin borders. You're going to see that these satin borders look really thick, overly thick. But if you look at the piece, that face is absolutely nice and clean in the real piece, but it looks overly thick because the satins are too close together. The fills are too close together. They're going to pull apart. You're going to notice that we have a much bolder look to these lines than we have on my final piece. And I'll try and bring that final piece up for you so you can see it. This is all happening in a very similar way. And you see that when we have satins meet satins, they overlap very deeply because they overlap in the same angle. When they overlap in the same angle, we know that things are both going to be pulling away from each other and that they're going to need to be fairly deeply overlapped. So things like if we see this mane on the horse that is made of multiple satin stitches, you're going to see really deep overlaps, 50% distance overlaps throughout it, because we don't want those to pull apart when they're in that same angle. So though I've showed you a bunch of very simple examples, complex examples follow those same rules. If we look at this piece from Chambers, and like I said, I'll try and show you the embroidery for those again. You may have seen these in previous shows. This piece has lots of different fill objects on top of each other, and you're going to see as I overlap these, I'm always paying attention to the overlap in the angle. And even with curves in multiple angles, that nominal angle is still where you're going to see me pay a lot of attention to these deep overlaps, and more in satins than in fills. But as we go through these, the other thing I wanted to show you was that same pull and push is always in effect. In this case, I have a place where the border had to be run later than this feather, and I didn't want it to creep up into the arrow. How did I do that? I stopped early. In the final piece, this looks like it just kisses right together. Why? This border had to run later than the feathers in the border of this arrow, so I didn't want it to overlap into it. I left a gap there so it wouldn't. We have the edges of this arrowhead here, the fletching on the arrow here. I want them to just meet, and in the 3D preview at size, they look like they just do. But if we get much closer, you can see that I've got probably almost a 0.5 millimeter gap in some places because all of these little satin stitches pushing toward the outside edge. I need to have a gap so that when I run my straight stitches, they just hit on the edge and don't have excess. This pull and this push is always happening, and we're always paying attention to it. Satin stitches where they overlap in the same angle, as in these shadows and the kind of shadows, this cast shadow and the lettering on top of it. We have nice deep overlaps in those satins because we don't want those to pull apart as the lettering gets narrower, as the satin stitches in the shadow pull tighter and get narrower themselves. We don't want a gap between them, so we have a nice deep overlap between those letters and those borders. You can't be afraid of overlapping, especially in the same angle, 2 layers of satin stitch. It's just not going to cause excess bulk. Where you do see excess bulk is where we have multiple layers together, and I'll actually run this back, and you'll see that I did leave gaps for the lettering here. Why? Because I don't want 4, 5, 6, 7 layers of penetration points on top of each other, but the 2 layers that are made up of the shadow and the border are totally fine. And as you can see, even up to and including some of them having more layers, we have 3 layers in some spots, or at least we're very close to that, where we have the underlying fill inside of these counters on the B. So pull and push compensation, right? It is constant. It is always there. It's something that you're going to see in all shapes and all embroidery. And no matter how we slice it, no matter how we change things, very obviously, we're always going to see that being part of our kind of embroidery world. So what we need to think of is the things that come together to make it happen and what we can do to compensate for it. We know that it is very dependent on angle. We know that it is very much dependent on not only the angle, but it is reinforced or it is exaggerated by how the material moves. So we know that we need to stabilize carefully. We need to have a hoop that arrests motion as best it can. We know that if we are working with a fabric with a grain or thickness, we have to take that into account, and especially fabric that has a weak angle or an angle where it stretches quite a bit. We might want to think about that if our stabilizer is not doing enough to counteract that, or if we want to use lighter stabilizer for a nicer hand, then we have to know that we're going to have more stretch in that angle and watch our stitch angles. But ultimately, it is something that we can measure. It is something that we know is coming. It is something that is fairly constant and that we can predict. I mean, as much as I'm showing you this stuff as if it is a very highly technical thing, and it is, there is definitely something to feel, right? We know the 2 kind of cardinal rules, right? If it's perfect on screen, it will be distorted at the machine. The distortion is always happening no matter what we think about it. It's fine if we don't like the distortion is coming for us. And we want to measure that distortion and correct it, compensate for it, counteract it in the angle of that distortion to create perfection, to create a design that looks the way we want it to, that lands where it should. And honestly, there's more things we can talk about with the interaction of stitches with the rest of the way that works. But I think, honestly, if you keep it to this frame, you could keep this on your desk and you would know what you needed to know forever. Because though this is what happens to satin stitch letters in a single color, we understand the motion that's happening on the machine. We understand the stretching that's happening. We understand the distortion. And if we understand that distortion, then adding another color on top of it, we understand that those interactions of thread are going to happen. If we keep that physicality in mind, we know what's happening. And ultimately, if we're talking about correcting things, it's all about the sample and correcting against the sample, right? I've talked about smart testing before, and I think what I'll do to finish this out is talk about smart testing again, if I can bring that up, the concept of how we test and correct for things. And I think that's really a viable way to kind of finish this out, though we could talk about other things in general. Smart testing is where we look at our piece, we sample. So smart, sample, looking at the piece, seeing what is going on. It really requires us to stitch. That's the biggest thing. We have to stitch the piece and know what's going on. So honestly, that's the first step in this. We have to know what's going on. We have to sample it. We have to stitch it out. So your S could be sample or stitch. In fact, I'll go ahead and bring this up. I have some slides for this. So we'll go ahead and bring these up. I've done this before, but I think it's worthwhile to show you guys in the same format and kind of give you one more chance at this smart testing concept. You stitch your design using the proper materials, watching the run and noting the problem. So this is something we do with other people's designs, with our own designs, no matter what's going on. We want to stitch and watch. Now, I know people are going to say, man, I can't sit and watch through an entire run. If you're having tons of problems and you're ruining garments and you're frustrated on learning this stuff, watching a design run is a very good way to get to grok, to understand, aside from just in your head, what's going on the machine and how the fabric is distorting. So you stitch to your design on the proper materials, watching the design run, noting problems. So keep notes if you need to. It will help you to go back and understand what's going on. And as we can see, We have jersey knit with a vertical grain. We got piqué polo. It's very honeycomb-like and has deep pits. We got chambray that can show the white borders around it because of the white fabric or the white weave underneath. We've got twill, and there's some stabilizer. These are all going to act differently under tension. They're all going to act differently when we start poking holes through them. I mean, to poorly paraphrase Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until we start stabbing needles through it. Everybody's got a plan for how the material is going to move until we start stitching. We stitch the design on our proper materials, and then we'll see what goes on with it. And yes, like I show on my show, and like I show the Ball of Shame is full of samples. We sampled everything. Any new color got sampled. Any new variation got sampled. Any garment that we hadn't run before got sampled. And honestly, even ones that we did run before, sometimes if anybody had a half of a doubt, we threw it on the machine, sampled it, because the time spent in this sample and cutting up old garments that were rejects is absolutely worth not wasting it, especially in the world I come from, which is multi-head embroidery. Wasting 12 shirts at a whack will teach you stuff real quick. You'll learn your lesson, and you'll learn that sampling time is worth figuring into your bills, for sure. But the next thing is you measure. This is a piece I did, a crane jacket bag, so it's got a big crane on it. And you can see problems. You look at this piece and go, man, I noticed immediately, I've got these issues. I've got a gap here. I need to measure it. I'm about 1 millimeter off in this gap. This fill really pulled in on this big, heavy Carhartt sweatshirt that's stretchy. It's sunk in and pulled in. I've got a large logo here. It pulled in. It's not looking great. I've got some stuff that's sticking out here, and I'm going to note that and measure those things. Say, I'm a millimeter off right here. I'm a half a mil right here in this direction. And then we're going to analyze. Go, okay, I'm looking at the way the design's put together. Well, this is the horizontal. This is how the design is existing right now as it is. Before I ran it on the machine, we have a horizontal fill here, meaning it should pull in this direction. And man, look at that. My outline is going just right on this piece. I think it's right exactly there. It probably pulled away from that outline. I need to probably do something about that. How was the design put together, and think about how the process happened? Well, this pulled in more than I thought it would, or the new material sinks in more than the other material we started on, the big canvas jackets or the duck cloth. I'm going to have to do something about that. So I analyze it and say, well, looks like this probably is right on the edge and needs more compensation. So we rework. I look at that design. I go, well, I'm off by almost a whole millimeter. Even though it looks crazy, I'm going to grab the points on this, and in the angle of pull, I'm going to pull it out. I'm going to grab that and extend, throw wide, cast wide beyond my straight stitch border in the distance that I'm missing. I'm going to rework the design in the area where the problem is. And then test. At the very end, I'm going to test the alterations. I'm going to run it one more time, watching carefully for how my changes affected the piece, and say, all right, now I'm hitting my borders. Now I feel good. That's what I needed to do. That's what I needed. Now I can throw that thing on the machine, and I'm going to run that on as many of these sweats as I have to, and no problems, because I know what's going to happen with it. And that's the thing, right? I mean, the smart testing is really just saying, stop, watch it, measure what's wrong, correct it with the knowledge that we've gone over today of what angle causes pull distortion, what angle causes push distortion, what's happening there. Stop short, swing wide. If we notice we're off by a millimeter, add the millimeter back. It's not actually that difficult to grasp once you know why stitches work the way they do. You stop thinking of them as a digital object or a thread printer or as printing at all, and you think of them as the needles that are inserting these tense loops through the garment, thousands of them at a time, and pulling on them in one angle. If we start thinking about that physicality, the correction starts to become very easy to compensate for. You understand it. Though I'll say, on a complicated design where things are moving and all these different parts are going, you'll find sometimes that a fill over here that's not related to this other piece is pushing the fabric in one direction and causing something to go off in some other area. And you may find that the holistic nature of the entire design is what's actually wrong. You watch this thing run. It's why I do say watch when the design is causing you a lot of trouble and you don't understand it. Sit and watch. That time is really valuable. And it also teaches you later on how the motion, the apparent motion through the design, the pathing, the sequence, how those affect how designs run. And eventually it means that as a digitizer, you will get a feeling for this stuff. Or as an embroiderer, you'll be able to look at a design before you ever put it on your actual garment, run that sucker through your slow redraw or your draw ribbon, whatever it's called in your particular software, your replay, your slow replay. You'll watch that thing run one time and go, man, I can tell this is going to go off over here and I need to talk to my digitizer, or I need to be aware of like my stabilizer and hooping's got to be just right, or this thing is definitely going to go off. There's something you'll get over time. That's why I tell you to watch. But you can sometimes isolate things, but often it can be the entire design. In fact, Cindy has something she says here. She says, I have a friend who said when she has a very large logo, will run small parts of the logo so you aren't running parts over and over, just what's needing attention. Sometimes you can, yeah. And often I'll do that too. If I have an area where I see an interaction between a couple blocks of stitching is causing problems, I will sometimes cut that out and just run that. I will say, like I said kind of earlier, though, there are times where you do that and you get pretty close, but then you run your first sample. What I would say is this. When your friend or you, if you're running a big design, you're trying to isolate it, when you get close to it, don't just go to the don't go to your most expensive garment on that last run. Don't go straight to a multi-het run. When you get close to it, run one sample first. Even if it's a good sample, if you're pretty confident in it, go ahead and run one of your good pieces. If you really feel like you got it, fine. But run one, don't run multiples at the very least, because sometimes you'll find that something I'm doing with a big fill over here is pushing the entire design over to one side, or it's causing a little bit of tweaking that if I don't have that stress on it, might not happen if I only isolate one piece. Not all the time. Frequently enough, it's happening in that local area. But if you are doing that, I would say your last run should always still be a sample run if you can. Run the little items if you need to, but the last run should always be a sample run. All right, folks, that is time. That is well past the time that I probably should have had you guys stay for. But hey, I think that was a worthwhile thing. Push and pull compensation is a topic I will never stop covering for folks. If you're just starting as a digitizer, learning this will absolutely make your life better, 100%. Even if all you learn is that the stitches on the screen are not as important as the ones on the machine. So you know that the produce of the digitizer is the embroidery, not the file, and that the screen is lying to you a little bit. But understanding pull and push distortion, pull and push compensation, shape distortion really can make your embroidery life better, because you're not just shot in the dark, adding stabilizer, pulling this here, pulling that there, changing this, changing densities, things that don't even play into this world of distortion to try and fix something you don't really understand. Knowing how those motions work, knowing how those settings work makes a big difference. So honestly, if you remember that physicality and you understand those contributing factors, you get your hooping right, you get your stabilizer right for your garment and for the design you've got, and you watch that piece, you watch that extra piece run, you're going to understand a lot. All right, folks, last thing, just going to say one more time, this is the day. If you want the free Understanding Emblems class, I'm going to put this up for you to screenshot one more time or to click. I will add this to the YouTube description when we're done here, but other folks on Facebook and on other groups have been able to get this out of the chat. If you didn't get out of the chat, I will add it to the description on YouTube. By the way, YouTube is where I kind of consider the channel of record. If you can't find something, that's where to go to find it generally, but you can always contact me otherwise. This is the last day, though. If you get this link, you respond today before midnight my time. I'm just going to say it's midnight Mountain time, so don't waste time if you're somewhere where midnight is later than me. But honestly, that's when I'm going to cut that off today, midnight my time. You respond by then, you will get the free course. It may take me the weekend to get everybody out their emails and what have you. It's not an automated system. It will be me and my lonesome getting that out sometime this weekend. So prepare for it to be later on in the weekend, because I have something else that's pretty big going on this weekend as well. But that Understanding Emblems course, the Why Patches video, and the handouts will be coming to you for free. I believe next week we will probably then cover an update on patches and Q&A, kind of have some office hours for all you guys. But we may do a little bit of push and pull talk if people have questions after the fact. But go ahead and grab that. Also, if you're not done listening to me today, go check out Learning the Good and the Bad from the Ugly over at Images Magazine. So images-magazine.com is the easiest way to get to it, but this is a link direct to the digital edition. Once again, I'll throw that in the description for you guys. If you want to read a little bit and want to see lovely little magazine pictures of funny embroidery and talk about that. Otherwise, folks, it's been a great time talking about this. I still, as much as I teach this over and over and over again, I still see the value. And even as I look at it, I think about things that I communicate better. I know that in my world of embroidery, this was one of the things that caused me the most trouble early on, because I had no concept of what was going on. But stitch analysis, watching designs run, and really getting a handle on the physicality of fabric, thread, needle, and stabilizer and hoop, how those go together and all of those things all influence each other is critical. That holistic view will make a big difference for you. All right, folks, thank you for being here, and I can't wait to see you again next week.